Now we turn to an important, difficult challenge right now, confronting death, grief, and mourning. This is a sad topic, but it's not only sad, it's necessary. Because avoiding the reality and impact of America's growing death toll right now wouldn't honor the people we've lost, nor advance healing, nor the unity we need. So as America faces this death toll, which literally rivals entire wars we've fought put together, I want to turn with you right now to some lessons from history, how past presidents have confronted national tragedies and led our nation not only on the tangible part, issuing a policy response, paying for remedies, but how people have also stepped up to the intangible, consoling, grieving, praying. Consider how President Reagan talked about the lives lost when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, which so many Americans saw live on television.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Whatever people think of Reagan's ideology, it was an address America needed, comfort during tragedy. Many other leaders have stepped up to the horrific task of addressing a traumatized nation after all kinds of terrible, terrible things that you don't want to happen, including a period in our history where we had more than one assassination. Lyndon Johnson had a notoriously frosty relationship with the president he served, but he found the words to address a country that really seemed to stand still after the president was shot in broad daylight in a scene that would replay on air for years. Here it was, just days after John F. Kennedy was murdered.
Today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy lives on in the immortal words and works that he left behind. He lives on in the mind and memories of mankind. He lives on in the hearts of his countrymen.
He lives on. Many people could feel that. And that was obviously, historians tell us when we go back and read, it was a tough and violent time. It was just 5 years later that President Kennedy's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was running for president himself when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And in that era, obviously a time without the internet or all the instant updates that are so normal today, it literally fell to Robert Kennedy to break the news to a crowd. And Kennedy offered his earnest, vulnerable feelings while also trying in that very moment to be a leader who could credibly, morally, ethically urge calm when so many people were feeling anything but. And to do that, he invoked King's belief in prayer and love.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. So I ask you tonight to return home, to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true. But more importantly, to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love. A prayer for understanding and that compassion that of which I spoke.
Each of those incidents involved the sudden death of prominent Americans, a contrast to where we're living now, a current grinding march of everyday Americans dying, few of them well known in the way of those individuals. But other presidents have confronted mass death tolls and also focused on addressing the countless, basically unknown but forever changed and impacted families. Here was President Clinton after the Oklahoma City terrorist bombing.
And to all the members of the families here present who have suffered loss, though we share your grief, your pain is unimaginable, and we know that. Those who are lost now belong to God. Someday we will be with them, but until that happens, their legacy must be our lives.
President Obama, who was known to avoid much public emotion, shared his own grief, choking up when speaking about another violent attack during his tenure the mass shooting of first graders at Newtown.
First graders. And from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun. Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad.
And then there was September 11th. President Bush's foreign policy response, we all know, widely debated by Americans, the Republican Party leadership ultimately opposing the Iraq war that Bush said it must spawn. So we don't erase that part of the reaction. But history also shows there was wide agreement that President Bush stepped up to comfort the victims and work on leading the country during the tragedy towards attempted unity, immediately visiting a mosque to advocate tolerance and sharing grief with the whole nation.
We are here in the middle hour of our grief. To the children and parents and spouses and families and friends of the lost, we offer the deepest sympathy of the nation. And I assure you, you are not alone.
You probably remember those months, those years after 9/11, the many different ways we all grieved and remembered the dead in local acts and national ceremonies, in the anniversaries and the ongoing charity events. And today's pandemic death toll is now 30 times the number of Americans we lost in 9/11. We haven't had enough time, anything like an actual amount of enough time to devote any of that level of attention proportionally we did to each of those losses. And this thing isn't even close to over. But when you listen to these past presidents from both parties, there is more than a history lesson here, more than just a reminder of the way things were. Just looking at this, when we were putting it together and now as you're watching it, I think it does something else. It unavoidably, obviously, provides a bipartisan contrast to how the current president approaches this part of the job during this mounting death toll. How do you console and grieve with a nation that sorely needs it? Well, President Trump largely avoids any words of public condolence at all. That's unprecedented in history. And it's all the more striking because Trump has been talking more in public than most presidents did about most of the tragedies we just showed you. Indeed, the numbers here are the factual context. They will eventually also become history. In a month of virus briefings, Donald Trump spoke for a total cumulative of 13 hours, discussing the virus and the government response, 2 hours attacking his critics, 45 minutes praising his administration, but just under 5 minutes total expressing any condolence for victims or grieving. That's according to a count by the Washington Post. Today, the U.S. death toll surges over 90,000. And President Trump is talking about never forgetting the dead, a sentiment that he still immediately mixed with blaming the, quote, people